With the 2023 season over, the 10 Formula One teams are hard at work on their 2024 challenges, trying to catch up to Red Bull Racing. In this new series on the channel, we will be breaking down each of the major teams' 23 challenges and the changes they need to make in order to become title contenders for the upcoming 2024 Formula One season. And within this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the Mercedes Formula One team and of course their W14. Now, where exactly were the Mercedes' W14 areas of weakness? Well, I've highlighted a couple of key areas of development that the team will no doubt have an eye on when it comes to the W15 and trying to close the gap to the front runners. And we're going to kick things off with the team chasing the unobtainable goal through their zero pods design. Now, a lot has been said about the zero pod design over the last 2 years, with both Lewis and Toto being particularly vocal on the overall performance and behaviour of the W14. And this is understandable given the decision to stick with this philosophy after their false dawn at the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend in the 2022 season. Now, that choice to stick with this design led to a season-long set of consequences and self-imposed limitations in how far they could go to actively rectify these problems when they switched to a more conventional side pod design layout. Now, what were some of these limitations exactly? With restrictions in place under the budget cap, teams can't simply design and manufacture a new chassis to remedy the shortcomings found within their initial designs. Thus, when the team concluded a new sidepod layout was required to fix these problems, they had to do so in a more unconventional manner as a result. For Mercedes, this meant that the sys positions and the fairings are retained, with it absorbed into the new design language of this new concept, with slight alterations to accommodate this design. So of course this means none of this is optimized in a manner in which they would have wanted to had they had no restrictions placed on the budget and resources. And instead of being able to follow the majority of the grid, which followed Red Bull's lead on having an underbite lower leading edge protrusion from the air intake of the sidepod, you can see that now on the screen. This is done, of course, to extend the undercut and helps to protect the airflow being captured by the inlet from the rake generated by the front tyres. Mercedes, on the other hand, with having the sys fairings and upper and side impact structures staying where they were, designed around the zero pod, they ended up having an overbite, which is the exact opposite of what most of the grid were doing. And that is the only route that was left to them to take with this new design. And naturally, all these things have an effect on how the car handles from front to back, and everything from the front ring through to the Venturi tunnels to the side pods to the rear rings and diffuser all interact with one another. So when one part of the car isn't necessarily designed around all the other parts in its entirety, you're going to have a lot of so-called moving parts in place that don't necessarily interact fully in the way which was intended with the initial design. Another weakness which plagued both Russell and Hamilton throughout the 2023 season was the W14's performance in slow-speed corners. This was brought to light at the end of the Canadian Grand Prix by Lewis in the cool-down room. But the Canadian Grand Prix wasn't the first time we saw this particular weakness, as it was apparent from the first race while battling Fernando Alonso in Bahrain. Now, naturally, this issue brings problems to the team's drivers on two particular fronts. The first is they obviously will be losing time in comparison to the rest of the grid through all of the slow corners, but even more of an issue would be that, of course, of the tyre wear that they would have experienced in the first quarter of the season as a result of that. Because when the car moves around under traction and braking in the slow corners, that's when you heat the tyres up, both internally as well as on the surface of the tyre itself. And this brings about, an increase in tyre wear. Now, the team brought upgrades to try and remedy this throughout the course of the 23 season, starting at the Monaco Grand Prix. The main change came to the pickup position of the chassis itself, on the lead arm of the upper wishbone. The arm became mounted on top of the chassis rather than the 10 or so centimeters below that line in its previous guise. Obviously, this now would of course have an impact on the mechanical performance of the front suspension and the vehicle's dynamics as a whole. But there is clearly an aerodynamic advantage to be gained from this change, as the arm now falls more in line with the angle of the other elements, which are of course all being used to guide the airflow down and around the newly updated side pods. A further update was brought to the Hungarian Grand Prix, where a further change was made to the top wishbone's angle, which is highlighted in green. And this leads into the next design feature that the team needs to get right with the W15, and that is the seating position of their drivers. Now, this at first seemed to be a topic of discussion that in the early part of the year was initially believed to be connected to the front-end unpredictability that Lewis was constantly describing to the press and of course to the team. But it later was revealed by James Allison to be an issue that George was describing in the exact same manner. But what was interesting with his feedback regarding describing the same ugly characteristics was that the seating position was never mentioned. The seating position, in a sense, was something that you could say Lewis fixated on and believed to be the reason behind this unpredictability that he was constantly feeling from corner to corner. But this turned out to be misplaced. The only thing that would change from a driver's perspective, according to Allison, if they were to move the seating position further back, would be, for example, Lewis seeing more of an apex of the corner if he was to be sitting further back within the chassis, as opposed to the current situation of both drivers being on top of the front tyres with the W14. But whatever the case may be, in order for a driver to extract 100% out of a car, they need to feel at home and not have these negative feelings in the back of their minds, as well as through the seat of his cockpit. So it is imperative that the team still fixes this now much smaller than initially thought problem. So in closing, Mercedes, if they can rectify these bigger problems as well as some of the smaller ones, we can expect to see them make huge strides with the W15. And naturally, the law of diminishing returns is going to affect more of the top teams than it will Mercedes. So I expect to see a revitalized W15 in the hands of both Lewis and George next season, fighting a lot closer to the front throughout the course of a season than they have done over the past 2 years. The 2024 season can't come quick enough.